Do you want to fight Russia once again, Polish lords? Once again, your land will be torn apart and handed over to your neighbors. History says so plainly, and yet you've learned nothing, arrogant, stupid lords. And by the way, you fight badly. We beat you before, and we will beat you again. Once it didn't work out so well, but then you got what you deserved. And before that as well. Traitors of the Slavic people. Wretches.
Russian propaganda is back to its favorite routine. Blame the West, attack Europe, and pretend the war in Ukraine is somehow everyone else's fault. European leaders are dragged through the mud non-stop, all to justify violence against a neighboring country. And while they talk about peace, their real goal remains unchanged: the complete destruction of Ukraine as an independent state. Negotiations only if Ukraine surrenders. Anything less simply does not interest Moscow. New week, new Russian nonsense. I'm Sofia, and this is Spin Snipers, where we tear apart Kremlin drama and serve up the brutal facts fast. Russia is once again staging negotiations largely to keep Donald Trump engaged. Real compromises are off the table, but demands towards Ukraine keep piling up. What Moscow now calls peace terms, including Ukraine's withdrawal its forces from Donbas, still is not enough for Vladimir Putin's imperial ambitions. And his longtime mouthpiece, Sergei Lavrov, has made those ambitions crystal clear. This was never about peace. It was about control.
A package of agreements was presented by the president in June 2024 and has been reaffirmed on multiple occasions. Our negotiators will continue to engage in dialogue in any format. They know their job. Once everything becomes clear, I am confident that the press will be informed.
And Lavrov is not alone. The so-called well-known Russian position is being hammered into audiences non-stop on state TV, repeated over and over, even as Moscow pretends to engage in talks with the Americans. The same Americans Putin is so eager to impress. But the message is clear. Without Ukraine meeting Russia's demands, there will be no peace. This is not negotiations, it's an ultimatum.
There's another hot-headed one there, Sibiha. This diplomat immediately insults everyone. Orban, Lukashenko. They supported the idea of stripping Transnistria of its independence. And he also claimed that Zelensky is ready to meet with Putin. Well, we've always said, you're welcome. The president of Russia is open, but on our terms of negotiations. And the presidential aide, Yuri Ushakov, responded very clearly, you know the address, Moscow, the Kremlin. Want to sign a capitulation nicely? Fine. But on the other hand, he'll get scared, a little guy.
Solovyov is not hiding it anymore. What Putin really wants is not peace, but Ukraine's outright capitulation. So the idea that a deal might be reached, that Ukraine could give up some land and everything would settle down, that's pure fantasy. Russia has no intention of stopping at Donbas. It openly claims Zaporizhia and Kherson, as well as regions it has already declared part of its so-called empire, despite not fully controlling them. So let's listen to Putin's own words, the speech every propagandist keeps quoting, to make one thing absolutely clear.
I will repeat, our principled position is as follows: a neutral, non-aligned, non-nuclear status for Ukraine. Its demilitarization and denazification, especially since all these parameters were broadly agreed upon during the Istanbul talks in 2022. Demilitarization was clearly defined there. Everything was spelled out. Numbers of this and that, tanks. Everything was agreed. Naturally, the rights, freedoms, and interests of Russian-speaking citizens in Ukraine must be fully guaranteed. The new territorial realities must be recognized. The status of Crimea, Sevastopol, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, and the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions as constituent entities of the Russian Federation. Going forward, all these basic and principled provisions must be fixed in the form of fundamental international agreements. Of course, this also implies the lifting of all Western sanctions against Russia.
Lifting sanctions, protecting the Russian language, handing over Ukrainian territory. Is not Russia asking a bit too much? Are Americans even aware of this wish list? Because this is where we are right now. This is what Moscow actually wants, nothing less. And for Putin, who loves lecturing the world on history, a reminder is in order. Before 2014, Russian language and culture were not oppressed in Ukraine. They dominated. Russian music, Russian films, Russian media were everywhere, largely as a result of decades of forced Russification and Soviet repression. When Ukraine finally began rebuilding its own language and identity after independence, it was insistently banned Nazism. Convenient, isn't it? And now, to justify the war once again, the Kremlin has dusted off another favorite tool, the so-called referendums.
At this point, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has once again appealed to the UN Secretariat with a request for an interpretation of what exactly the right of peoples to self-determination means and what it applies to. If the issue of Greenland is now being actively discussed, if the Greenlandic people have the right to self-determination, yes, then the question arises, why not the people of Crimea, the residents of Crimea, and why not Donbas, and why not Novorossiya? Wait a moment. Throughout all this time, Donbas has voted twice, in 2014 and in 2022. Everything was organized. A plebiscite was held in full compliance with international standards, in which a huge number of people expressed their will.
The people of Crimea, who exactly are we talking about here? If Russia means Crimean Tatars, then let's recall a key historical fact. Stalin, a figure openly glorified in today's Russia, orchestrated the genocide of the Crimean Tatar people in 1944. On his direct orders, more than 200,000 Crimean Tatars were forcibly deported within days to Central Asia and Siberia, thousands of kilometers from their homes, while Russians were resettled into Crimea. After the 2014 occupation, Putin effectively continued the same policy. So let's not pretend this is about respecting minorities. And if the Kremlin still tries to manipulate the narrative around Crimea, the Donbas myth collapses completely. The people of Donbas, who are they supposed to be? A newly invented nation? The people of Donbas are Ukrainians. Crimea is Ukraine. Donetsk and Luhansk are Ukraine, just like every city and village Russia invaded with war. Yet, Moscow keeps insisting that these people somehow chose their fate.
If, at the time, Ukraine, the Ukraine that claims to respect the will of the people, had agreed with the results of the voting in Donbas, Novorossiya, or Crimea, there would have been no bloodshed. Then the rights of the people living in the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic would not be in question today. Yes, the key issue now is territorial. The territory within the borders of the DPR is currently partially controlled by Ukrainian militants, and this is precisely the main point of contention in negotiations, whether to hand it over or not. But wait, everything was already voted on back in 2014. In 2014, more than 90% of the population living in these territories voted to leave Ukraine. That is, at the very least, what this is about. They left Ukraine, you have no claim whatsoever to this territory. Therefore, if you respect the will of the people and treat existing mechanisms with respect, you can calmly leave this territory based on the results of 2 referendums.
How exactly are the people supposed to express their free will when they're forced to vote at gunpoint? Seriously, how? And for anyone still thinking, well, there was a referendum, let's be clear. Russia organized it itself. First, they occupied the territory, then staged a vote to legitimize their land grab. Before 2014, Donetsk was one of the Ukraine's wealthiest and most vibrant cities, a place with concerts, international events, real life. And what is it now? Russia invested nothing. The city was left to rot. And as for peace talks, here is yet another round of nonsense from Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov.
For example, I heard that US Secretary of State M. Rubio, who was invited to the Senate, said that the issue of security guarantees has been resolved. We do not know what kind of guarantees they were discussing, but judging by everything, these were guarantees for that very Ukrainian regime, which is pursuing a Russophobic, neo-Nazi policy. If the goal is to preserve this regime on some part of the territory of the former Ukraine and continue turning it into a foothold for creating threats to the Russian Federation, then, I believe, you yourselves can understand that such security guarantees are hardly capable of ensuring a lasting peace.
So Russia says it's concerned about security guarantees for Ukraine? Here is a simple idea. Don't invade your neighbors. Vague promises and political declarations have already failed, twice. So if peace is meant to last, Ukraine needs real, enforceable security guarantees. One option currently discussed involves around 30,000 Western troops stationed far from the front lines, mostly in western part of Ukraine, focused on training Ukrainian forces. This is not NATO entering the war. Yet Moscow is already shouting about threats, which raises a fair question. Why does a nuclear superpower react to everything with such panic and hysteria?
The regime of V.A. Zelensky is, in many ways, a repetition of history, though not as a farce, because far too many people have died for it to be called one. People whose lives are being sacrificed by V.A. Zelensky and his masters, his Western patrons. This regime, which has adopted Nazi laws, destroyed all monuments that in any way recall our shared victory in the Great Patriotic War, a regime that glorifies S.A. Bandera, R.I. Shukevich, and other collaborators condemned by the Nuremberg Tribunal, and that encourages the ideology and practice of Nazism, as we are now seeing in practice, reflects the true intentions of the West. These intentions have not gone anywhere. They mean only one thing, that the West is once again ready to resort to these Nazi misanthropic methods, sowing hatred toward everything Russian and toward Russia itself, as long as Russia is not allowed to feel secure.
This is peak Kremlin fan fiction. According to Moscow, a Jewish president elected by millions somehow runs a Nazi regime, while Russia, invading a sovereign country, is supposedly fighting for peace and morality. World War II is dragged in as a propaganda prop, conventionally forgetting Stalin's alliance with Hitler and replacing history with hysteria. And of course, when the story collapses, the blame is shifted to the West, because admitting Russia's imperial ambitions would ruin the narrative. And just so you know, Europe got its own primetime segment on Russian TV. Apparently nothing like stirring up panic about the continent, while the real aggressor hides behind lies.
So what are we going to do? What are we going to do, Europeans? What are you going to do, you pathetic? And what are we going to do with you? Conquer you? There's no point. Not interesting. Not interesting at all. Besides, you have to exist, because watching you wallow in your own filth brings an astonishing kind of pleasure. And then along comes a man with a big stick to stir the shit in the vat. Merz. And, just so you know, Europe, it turns out, is a normative alternative to imperialism and autocracy. Yes, naturally. Go on, enlighten us.
After listening to Merz's speech on Europe's values, Russian TV, in their usual style, immediately started debating what values Europe actually brings. And of course, this quickly turned into a mix of criticism, invented fears about their Russian identity, and the usual fantasy that Europe is somehow trying to oppress Russia, conventionally ignoring their real values of freedom, human rights, and democracy.
Tell me, you What values? What values do you have? An anti-Christian, perverted civilization. What values are you even talking about? What are you on about? You don't even have democracy. A like you wasn't elected by the people at all. You don't have direct elections of your own authorities. You elect some obscure people into some obscure parliament that then decides everything. Let me remind you, your country is occupied. You have foreign troops stationed on your territory, and you pay them to stay there, and you buy weapons from them. And those 5% you pay to NATO, what exactly are you paying for?
So-called Holy Russia, the self-proclaimed bastion of high moral values, which daily kills its neighbors, suddenly decided to ponder its own values. And of course, it's pure nonsense. They preach peace, justice, and human rights while justifying the shelling of civilians' Ukrainian cities. They even had time to comment on Ukraine, claiming it's somehow our fault for violating their interest. Classic Russian propaganda, committing violence while lecturing the world on what's supposedly moral and valuable.
I can't get these images out of my head. Maybe you've seen them too. The flash mob videos in Ukraine related to the energy situation. All of this, by the way, connects with that French story about women's accessories. This isn't a banal story. It's a deep story about the values being imposed on Ukraine. And I don't know if you remember that girl who aged, 14 years? Whether she saw this story or not. The one who back on Maidan spoke about her dream. This is the underside of European integration, the one that never really happened. And now, of course, there are these flash mobs with youth shouting, spreading snacks and drinks, half naked, dancing near some apartment blocks, celebrating themselves. This is where it's all leading.
Ukrainians are struggling to stay warm after Russia's massive attacks, leaving hundreds of thousands without heat or electricity in the middle of winter. Meanwhile, this highly moral country might want to take a look at itself first. After all, vodka is cheaper than a book, yet they lecture us about values. And it's not just merit they're targeting. The Russians even went after Poland's president, Karl Nawrocki.
The disgusting speech by the Polish Nawrocki once again confronts us with a very important question. Are we sure that Poland can exist as a unified state at all? I simply want every Russian to hear Nawrocki's words and understand that the president of Poland, Nawrocki, is a personal enemy of every Russian. Moreover, the president of Poland, Nawrocki, is a war criminal who, in his speech, publicly denies the rulings of the Nuremberg Tribunal. Therefore, in fact, a criminal case should be opened on this basis, and he should be placed on an international wanted list.
What caused such reaction? Simply put, Poland has not forgotten how Stalin and Hitler divided their country during World War II. And Nawrocki reminded everyone of that. After the war, Poland ended up under the so-called Soviet protectorate and calls it what it was, an occupation. And Russia is not exactly thrilled by that reminder.
Sometimes you think, we fed these, we gave them water, we rebuilt their cities. Exhausted Russian, Soviet troops, with their last strength, rushed to support the Warsaw Uprising back then, even though they were told to wait. And how many of our people died? And now this opens its dirty mouth. A big question arises, an obvious one, and there will be an answer. Do you want to fight Russia once again, Polish lords? Once again, your land will be torn apart and handed over to your neighbors. History says this plainly, and you've learned nothing, arrogant lords.
Russia brazenly and arrogantly keeps threatening the entire world. Peace in Ukraine is not on their agenda. They want nothing less than full conquest and capitulation. At the same time, they keep mentioning Europe, showing off their imperial ambitions and maximalist mindset. That's it for today. While the Russian propaganda machine keeps running, we'll keep exposing their lies. I'm Sofia, and this is Spin Snipers. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and don't fall for the spin.